I committed my mother thinking she was psychotic. 6 months later, I discovered that each episode, each delusion, each scream in the psychiatric hospital was pretense to punish me for living far away. My mother's screams echoed down the psychiatric hospital corridor while 2 nurses tried to restrain her, her nails clawing at the air as if she could tear reality itself in half. "Marina abandoned me. My daughter left me to die alone," she yelled, her body contorting with a strength I never imagined a 68-year-old woman could possess, saliva dripping from the corner of her mouth, her eyes rolled back showing only the whites, a performance worthy of any horror movie I'd ever watched. I was paralyzed at the door of room 203, legs trembling, the coffee I was holding spilling over my fingers without me feeling the burn, because at that moment, my brain simply couldn't process anything beyond the absolute chaos unfolding before me. Dr. Beatrice Fontana approached with firm steps, a syringe in hand, her white coat contrasting with the grayish chaos of that corridor that smelled of disinfectant mixed with human despair. "Mrs. Helena, I need you to calm down," she said with that professional voice doctors use when dealing with extreme situations. But my mother only screamed louder, spitting disconnected words about abandonment, ungrateful children, about how I had stolen her youth and now left her to rot alone. It was March 23rd, a Tuesday that had started like any other, with my alarm going off at 6:30 in the morning, with no warning that my life was about to turn upside down in a way I could never have imagined. It had all started 3 weeks earlier, when my mother called at 2 in the morning saying there were people inside her apartment, that they were stealing her memories, literally taking the memories out of her head with an invisible machine. I lived 40 minutes away, had an important presentation at the university the next day, but I still got in my car and went there, finding her sitting in the corner of the living room, hugging her knees, babbling about government conspiracies and chips implanted in her brain. I called an ambulance that same night, accompanied her to the emergency room, where a tired on-call doctor said it was just an episode of acute anxiety, prescribed a sedative and sent us home. But the episodes continued, increasingly elaborate, increasingly convincing. She threw all electronic devices out the window, saying they were spying on her thoughts, tore out all the telephone wires, swearing she heard voices coming from them. Spent 3 days without sleeping because she was certain that if she closed her eyes, they would come for her. Roberto, my brother who lives in another city and shows up once a year at Christmas when he doesn't have a more important commitment, obviously said I was overreacting, that mother had always been dramatic, that I should simply ignore it and let it pass. "You've always been too sensitive, Marina," he said over the phone while I heard the sound of papers being shuffled on the other end of the line, clearly doing something else while pretending to give me attention. The decision to commit her wasn't easy. Went through 3 different psychiatrists, each with a divergent opinion about what was happening. The first said it could be early dementia. The second suspected late-onset bipolar disorder. The third was categorical, acute psychotic break. Needed immediate hospitalization for stabilization and investigation. I signed the papers with trembling hands, the pen weighing tons, each letter of my name being written with the feeling that I was betraying the woman who raised me, even though our relationship had always been complicated, full of emotional blackmail and manipulations that made me spend years in therapy trying to understand where love ended and control began. The psychiatric clinic was in a remote area of the city, surrounded by trees that seemed to form a barrier between the real world and that parallel universe where people lost touch with reality. The main building had 3 floors, windows with discreet white, painted bars to make them look less prison. Like, well, maintained gardens trying to mask the nature of the place. When we arrived for the admission, my mother was strangely calm, almost resigned, holding my hand with disproportionate strength and whispering, "6 months, Marina, in 6 months you'll understand everything." I interpreted that as just another delusion, another phrase disconnected from reality. I had no way of knowing it was a calculated prophecy, a veiled threat disguised as madness. The first days were the worst. Constant calls from the clinic reporting crises, outbursts of aggression, refusal to take medication, escape attempts. Nurse Claudia, a woman with strong features and a soft voice who seemed to have infinite patience, called me almost daily with updates. "Your mother spent the night awake walking in circles in her room. Today she refused to eat, saying the food was poisoned. We had to apply physical restraint because she tried to attack another patient." Each call was a punch to the stomach, a confirmation that I had made the right decision, but also a constant reminder that I had placed my own mother in a psychiatric hospital. Visits were limited to twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays, always from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. I went religiously, carrying bags with the things she asked for. old magazines, specific chocolates from a brand found only in a market on the other side of town, an expensive French perfume she swore helped keep the mental invaders away. During visits, she alternated between moments of apparent lucidity, where we talked about trivialities like the weather or the garden flowers, and sudden explosions of paranoia, where she accused me of conspiring with the doctors to steal her inheritance, an inheritance consisting of a 2-bedroom apartment and a modest pension. Roberto appeared exactly once during the first 2 months, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, stayed 15 minutes, said he had an unavoidable commitment, and left behind a generic bouquet of flowers he bought at the hospital convenience store. "You're handling this so well, Marina," he said before leaving, as if it were a compliment, as if the fact that I was taking on all the responsibility alone was something worthy of admiration rather than questioning. My mother didn't even look at him during the visit, kept her eyes fixed on the window, murmuring something about mechanical birds sent by the government to watch the patients. After he left, she turned to me and said with frightening clarity, "He was never really here. You know that, don't you? Roberto died when he was 5 years old. The one who comes here is an imposter." For a moment, a brief and terrifying moment, I almost believed it, because the way she said it, the tone of absolute conviction, made me question my own perception of reality. That's when I understood how thin the veil between sanity and madness is, how easy it would be to let oneself be carried away by that spiral of delusions and paranoia. The group therapy sessions were conducted by psychologist Lucas, a man too young to be dealing with such complex cases. I thought the first time I saw him, with his disheveled hair and a smile that seemed too genuine for that environment. But he had a special gift for dealing with patients, a way of making them feel heard without validating their delusions, a fine line he navigated masterfully. My mother, surprisingly, seemed to like him, actively participated in the sessions, although her contributions were always loaded with conspiracy theories and veiled accusations against me. "My daughter put me here because she wants my apartment," she said in a session that I was able to observe through a mirrored glass. "She has always been envious, always wanted everything I had, even my husband had eyes for her." The accusation was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality. My father died when I was 16, and our relationship was one of distant but respectful affection, that it made me question whether that woman was really my mother, or if something fundamental had broken inside her, transforming her into a stranger inhabiting the familiar body. Donna Carmen, the neighbor who had known my mother for more than 30 years, called me crying after a visit to the clinic. "I don't recognize Helena anymore," she sobbed over the phone. "She told me terrible things, said that I had always been jealous of her, that I tried to steal her husband, that I placed cameras in her apartment to spy on her. Donna Carmen was a sweet lady who had taken care of me countless times when I was a child, who made the best carrot cake in the world, and who treated my mother like a sister." Hearing that even she was being targeted by the paranoid accusations broke my heart in a different way, because it meant that my mother's illness did not discriminate. It indiscriminately attacked everyone who had once been important to her. I tried to console her, explain that it was the delusions talking, not my real mother, but even as I said those words, I wondered if such a distinction really existed, if we could separate the person from the disease when the disease seemed to have completely consumed who the person used to be. In the 3rd month of hospitalization, there was a subtle but noticeable change in her behavior. The violent outbursts decreased. She began taking medication without resistance, participated in therapeutic activities with what doctors described as encouraging progress. Dr. Beatriz Fontana, who had taken over the case after the previous doctor went on leave, seemed optimistic but cautious. Psychotic disorders can have periods of remission, she explained to me during a family meeting where Roberto participated via video conference, claiming to be on a business trip. But it's important to maintain vigilance and not rush discharge. She had a peculiar way of tilting her head when she heard something that caught her attention, like a bird studying something curious. And I noticed she did this frequently when talking about my mother. "Your mother is an interesting case," she said once, and something in her tone made me feel a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain exactly why. The letters began to arrive in the 4th month, written by hand with that elaborate handwriting my mother always had, full of flourishes and dramatic curves. They were both coherent and disturbing. "Dear Marina," one of them began, "I know you think you did what's best for me, but you need to understand that there are greater forces at play here. The doctors are all bought, part of the system that wants to silence us. But I'm smarter than them. I pretend to take the medications, pretend to believe their lies. Soon I'll get out of here and then you'll see the truth." I read that letter so many times that I memorized every word, trying to find between the lines some sign of the mother I knew, some trace of the woman who, despite all her flaws, raised and cared for me. But all I found were layers upon layers of paranoia, elaborate theories about medical conspiracies, governmental ones, even alien ones in some of the more delirious letters. The 5th month brought a stabilization that seemed almost miraculous. My mother was taking medication regularly, participating in all therapies, even making friends with other patients. During visits, we conversed almost normally. She asked about my work at the university, about my students, showed what seemed to be genuine regret for the problems she had caused. "I know I haven't been easy," she said on a sunny afternoon as we walked through the clinic's garden, "but you need to understand that sometimes the mind plays tricks on us, makes us believe in things that aren't real." The lucidity of that moment was so perfect, so complete, that I allowed myself to hope that perhaps we could rebuild some kind of relationship. Perhaps we could overcome decades of hurt and manipulation and find some kind of peace. Roberto, of course, interpreted the improvement as a sign that I had exaggerated from the beginning, that the hospitalization had been unnecessary, that I had always been too dramatic. "See? I told you it was just a phase," he commented during one of the rare calls, completely oblivious to the months of suffering and chaos that preceded that apparent improvement. It was on a Thursday of the 6th month that everything began to crumble, or rather, to reveal itself. I had gone for an extra visit authorized by Dr. Fontana to discuss the possibility of discharge and preparation for my mother's return home. I arrived earlier than agreed and, while waiting at the reception, I heard voices coming from an adjacent room. I immediately recognized my mother's voice, clear and perfectly lucid, without any trace of the mental confusion that supposedly afflicted her. 6 months, I told her. 6 months, and she would be begging for me to come back. Look, it didn't even take that long. She's already here discussing my discharge, desperate to fix things. The laugh that followed was cold, calculated, completely different from any sound I had ever heard come out of her mouth. "You really thought I was crazy?" she continued, apparently speaking to someone on the phone. "It was the best performance of my life. All those years in amateur theater finally served some purpose. That ungrateful daughter needed to learn a lesson, needed to understand what it's really like to care for someone, to worry, to feel guilty. Now she knows. Now she'll never be able to abandon me again." My world collapsed at that moment, standing there in the hallway with my hand on the doorknob, unable to open the door, unable to move, unable to breathe. 6 months. 6 months of anguish, sleepless nights, corrosive guilt eating me from the inside, questioning every decision I had made regarding her. 6 months of watching what I believed to be my mother's mental deterioration, crying in the car after each visit, taking antidepressants to be able to function. 6 months of elaborate lies, manipulation on a level I could never have imagined possible, of cruelty so refined it bordered on sociopathic. Nurse Claudia found me there, still paralyzed, silent tears streaming down my face. "Are you okay?" she asked, and I just pointed to the door, unable to form words. She must have seen something in my face because she immediately went to call Dr. Fontana. The confrontation that followed was surreal. My mother, caught red-handed, initially tried to deny it, then pretend another episode. But Dr. Fontana was not easily fooled. "Mrs. Helena," she said with that professional calm that I now understood concealed a razor-sharp mind, "I've been suspicious for several weeks. Your episodes were too convenient, too well-timed, too theatrical. Psychologist Lucas also noticed inconsistencies in your behavior during group sessions, but we needed concrete evidence. It turned out that Dr. A.'s Fontana had discreetly installed recorders in the room after her suspicions intensified, something that would normally be unethical, but was justified given the exceptional circumstances. The recordings revealed conversations where my mother meticulously planned each crisis, studied psychiatric symptoms in books that Mrs. Carmen innocently brought in hidden, practiced facial expressions of madness in the bathroom mirror. Why? Was all I could ask when I finally recovered my voice, sitting in Dr. Fontana's office with my mother in front of me, now without masks, without pretense, just her in her most raw and honest form. "Because you abandoned me," she answered with a coldness that made me shudder. "Because you chose to live far away, chose your career, your independent life, instead of taking care of me like a good daughter should. Roberto at least has the excuse of distance, but you chose to leave me alone. So I needed to teach you a lesson, needed to make you feel the weight of guilt. Understand what it's like to be responsible for someone. Feel the desperation of seeing someone you love losing their sanity. Each word was a dagger, each sentence a revelation of a level of narcissism and manipulation that transcended anything I had experienced before, even from her. Dr. Fontana explained that what my mother had done constituted not only fraud. After all, health insurance had covered the hospitalization based on false diagnoses, but also severe psychological abuse. This is known as Munchausen syndrome, she explained. Although in this specific case, it's a variation where the person feigns symptoms not for medical attention, but to emotionally manipulate specific family members. The clinic was preparing a detailed report. There would be legal consequences, lawsuits, public exposure. My mother listened to everything with a smile on her lips, as if she were still in control, as if everything were still part of her grand plan. "You can't prove anything," she said confidently. "I'm an elderly lady, a widow, abandoned by my children. Who would believe I would be capable of something like this?" But the recordings were irrefutable evidence, as were the testimonies of professionals who now, in retrospect, could identify all the inconsistencies and signs that had initially gone unnoticed. Roberto, when informed by phone, had the audacity to say that he always knew something was strange, that he never fully believed in the breakdown, conveniently forgetting all the moments when he minimized my suffering and accused me of exaggeration. "You should have noticed, Marina," he said, as if it were my fault for being deceived. Mother was always dramatic, always liked to be the center of attention. The ease with which he distanced himself from any responsibility, the way he transformed his absence into virtue, made me understand that I had two family problems, not just one. The dysfunction was systemic, intertwined in every interaction, in every family dynamic that I had normalized over the years. The discharge process was complex, because now it was no longer a traditional psychiatric case, but a delicate legal situation. My mother couldn't simply be released. There were fraud issues to be resolved, compensation to be paid, and ironically, a real psychiatric evaluation to be done. Because someone capable of maintaining such a farce for 6 months clearly had deep psychological issues, just not the ones she had pretended to have. Dr. Fontana diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial traits, a dangerous combination that explained not only this episode, but decades of manipulative and abusive behavior that I had suffered. "Your mother is not psychotic," she explained to me in a private session, "but she is definitely not well. The difference is that this condition does not absolve her of responsibility for her actions. On the contrary, she was completely conscious and in control the whole time." Donna Carmen was devastated when she learned the truth. She had been an involuntary piece in my mother's cruel theater, bringing books about psychiatry, thinking she was helping a sick friend understand her condition, when in reality, she was providing research material for an elaborate performance. "How could she do this?" she asked me, crying. "How can someone pretend to be crazy for so long just to hurt their own daughter?" I had no answer, because I myself was still trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal, trying to reconcile the image of the mother I thought I knew with the reality of the calculating monster she had revealed herself to be. The trauma was not just from the 6 months of farce, but from an entire life being revised in a new light, each memory being reevaluated, each moment of apparent affection being questioned. Therapist Lucas, in an informal conversation with me after everything was revealed, admitted that he had begun to suspect in the 3rd month. There was something too performative about her breakdowns, he said, as if she were following a script, citing symptoms from medical books instead of actually experiencing them. But it's very difficult to prove someone is faking, especially when the performance is so elaborate. He mentioned that in 20 years of career, he had never seen anything similar in terms of duration and complexity of the farce. Most people who fake psychiatric symptoms can't maintain consistency for more than a few weeks. But my mother had created a complete character, with nuances, evolutions, even apparent improvements that were part of the plan to make everything more believable. Public exposure was inevitable. The case was too unique, too bizarre not to attract media attention. Suddenly, I was the daughter who had been the victim of one of the cruelest family manipulations ever documented, my private life dissected on television programs. My pain transformed into entertainment for masses eager for real drama. My mother, of course, loved the attention, even if it was negative. During the interviews she gave, against legal advice, she painted herself as a victim, a desperate mother who just wanted the attention of her neglectful daughter, distorting the narrative to gain sympathy from people who didn't know the complete story. Roberto kept completely away from the media exposure, claiming he needed to protect his family and his business. once again leaving me alone to deal with the consequences of the family circus. The following weeks were a blur of legal procedures, consultations with lawyers, therapy sessions to try to process the trauma. I discovered that it wasn't just me who needed psychological help. Several clinic staff who had cared for my mother also reported feeling manipulated and used, especially those who had developed genuine concern and affection for her during the supposed illness. Nurse Claudia confessed to me that she cried when she discovered the truth, not only because of the cruelty of the act, but because it made her question her capacity for professional judgment. If she managed to fool me so completely, she said, how many other patients might be faking and I don't notice? The cascading effect of my mother's manipulation affected far more people than just me, leaving a trail of distrust and questioning in everyone who had contact with her. In the end, after all the exposure, lawsuits, and drama, I was left with an impossible decision. What to do about my relationship with my mother? Legally, I could and should cut off contact completely. I had more than enough grounds for a restraining order if I wanted one. But reality is more complex than theory. She was still my mother, the only one I had, as terrible as she might be. And some masochistic part of me still hoped that maybe, after everything was exposed, she could show some genuine remorse, some glimpse of humanity. But during our last conversation at the clinic, before she was transferred to deal with the legal consequences of her actions, all she said was, "You'll never be able to abandon me now, Marina. Whenever you think about walking away, you'll remember these 6 months. You'll wonder if I'm really well or faking again. I won, darling." Even with all this, I won. And the worst part is that she was right. Even knowing that everything had been a farce, even with all the justified anger and indignation, I couldn't simply turn my back and walk away. The trauma had created a distorted connection, a constant vigilance where I found myself checking news about her, making sure she was where she was supposed to be, that she wasn't planning something new. Dr. Fontana explained to me that this was common in victims of prolonged psychological abuse, especially when the abuser is a parent. "You were conditioned since childhood to feel responsible for her emotional well-being," she said. "That pattern doesn't break easily, even when you rationally understand the manipulation. The therapy would be long, the healing process complex, and perhaps I would never be able to completely free myself from the psychological bonds my mother had created over decades, and reinforced with this last and most cruel act of manipulation. The truth is that my mother's psychotic episode theater wasn't an isolated event, but the culmination of a lifetime of performances. Looking back, I can see the patterns. The convenient illnesses before my important events, the dramatic crises when I tried to establish boundaries, the veiled threats disguised as maternal concern. What happened during those 6 months was merely the most extreme manifestation of a pattern that had always existed, except this time she had gone too far, crossed a line that not even she could pretend didn't exist. And now, as I try to rebuild my life, I carry with me the awareness that maternal love, this concept that society paints as unconditional and pure, can be the most devastating of weapons when in the hands of someone capable of using it to destroy instead of build. My mother's hysterical screams cut through the heavy air of the hospital corridor like sharp blades while 2 burly nurses desperately tried to restrain her, her long, unkempt nails violently scratching at the emptiness, as if she could literally tear the fabric of reality and escape to an alternative dimension where ungrateful daughters didn't abandon elderly and lonely mothers. It was exactly 14:37 on a humid and oppressive Tuesday in March, a time that became permanently engraved in my traumatized memory, as the exact moment when my carefully structured 42-year-old life began to crumble in slow motion before my incredulous and exhausted eyes. Marina abandoned me to die alone. My own daughter wants to see me rotting in a nursing home, she screamed with a vocal force that seemed impossible for a 68-year-old woman with chronic health problems, her thin body contorting with theatrical violence while thick saliva abundantly dripped from the corner of her half-open mouth, and her completely rolled, back-brown eyes showed only the yellowish white, creating a disturbing image that seemed to come directly from a low-budget psychological horror film. I was completely paralyzed at the entrance to room 203 of the psychiatric ward, my legs trembling uncontrollably, as if they had turned to jelly. The steaming coffee I held in my right hand slowly spilling over my numb fingers without me being able to feel the characteristic burn. Because at that specific moment, my overloaded brain had simply turned off all non-essential functions to process the absolute and incomprehensible chaos that was violently unfolding in front of me. Dr. Beatrice Fontana approached with firm and determined steps through the corridor, illuminated by fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, a syringe filled with potent sedative in her right hand, her impeccably starched white lab coat dramatically contrasting with the gray and desperate chaos of that corridor that reeked of cheap hospital disinfectant, mixed with the unmistakable smell of concentrated human despair. "Mrs. Helena, I need you to calm down immediately so we can talk about your treatment," said the psychiatrist with that artificially calm, professional voice that doctors develop after years of dealing with extreme mental crisis situations. But my mother only intensified her hysterical screams, spitting disconnected words and delusional accusations about filial abandonment, about ungrateful children who suck the youth from their mothers only to discard them like hospital waste, about how I had systematically stolen her vitality for decades and now left her to rot alone in a fifth-rate psychiatric hospital. The sound of her hoarse and desperate voice echoed through the narrow corridors of the psychiatric ward, mixing with the distant moans of other patients in crisis, creating a macabre symphony of mental suffering that made me question whether I myself was losing contact with reality in that oppressive and claustrophobic environment. It had all started exactly 3 weeks before that infernal moment, when my mother called me at 2:15 in the morning on a Monday, her trembling and paranoid voice whispering over the phone that there were strange people inside her apartment, sinister individuals who were literally stealing her most precious memories directly from inside her head using an invisible brain extraction machine remotely controlled by the federal government. I lived 45 minutes away in a quieter part of the city, had a crucial presentation to the board of the university where I taught architecture scheduled for 8 o'clock the following morning. But even so, I took my silver sedan and drove through the deserted and poorly lit streets to her apartment, finding her huddled in the darkest corner of the living room, hugging her own bony knees, incoherently babbling about elaborate government conspiracies, tracking chips subcutaneously implanted in her brain during cataract surgery, and metallic voices whispering evil instructions through electrical outlets. I called an ambulance that same endless night, accompanied her during the tense journey to the nearest emergency room, where a visibly exhausted doctor, after 12 hours of uninterrupted shift, examined my mother superficially and declared with bureaucratic nonchalance that it was just an isolated episode of acute anxiety, enhanced by chronic insomnia, prescribed a generic fast, acting benzodiazepine, and sent us home with the vague recommendation to see a psychiatrist if symptoms persist for more than 72 hours. But the paranoid episodes not only persisted but progressively intensified, increasingly elaborate in their delusional complexity, increasingly convincing in their theatrical presentation. She threw all electronic devices out the third-floor window on a sunny Thursday afternoon, convinced they were transmitting her most intimate thoughts to an international espionage center. Violently ripped out all landline and internet wires, swearing she could hear demonic voices whispering threats through the copper cables. Spent 3 consecutive days and nights completely awake because she was absolutely certain that if she closed her eyes for even a second, they would come to take her away for clandestine medical experiments. Roberto, my older brother of 47, who lived in another city 600 kilometers away and appeared exactly once a year during Christmas holidays, when he didn't have more important corporate commitments or urgent international trips, obviously completely minimized the seriousness of the situation when I called desperately asking for help and guidance. "Marina, you've always been hypersensitive and too dramatic. Our mother has always been eccentric and theatrical. This is just another one of her performances to get attention," he said coldly over the phone while I could clearly hear the sound of papers being shuffled and keyboard being typed on the other end of the line, showing that he was doing other supposedly more important activities while pretending to give me fraternal attention. "You should simply ignore these outbursts and let them pass naturally. Eventually, she will tire of the theatrics and return to normal when she realizes she's not getting the emotional reaction she wants." The excruciating decision to commit her involuntarily was not taken lightly, going through 3 different psychiatrists in 2 weeks of tense consultations, each professional with a divergent opinion about what exactly was happening with my mother's deteriorating mental state. The first psychiatrist, an elderly gentleman with thick glasses and trembling hands, suspected early onset of vascular dementia with secondary psychotic symptoms. The second doctor, a young woman recently graduated from psychiatric residency, suggested the hypothesis of late onset bipolar disorder with psychotic features during a severe manic episode. The third specialist, a middle-aged man with experience in complex cases, was categorical and incisive in his diagnosis. Acute psychotic break of etiology to be clarified, requiring immediate psychiatric hospitalization for intensive medication, stabilization, and in-depth diagnostic investigation with neuroimaging exams and complete neuropsychological assessment. I signed the involuntary commitment authorization papers with violently trembling hands, the Mont Blanc pen that she herself had given me as a gift on my 30th birthday weighing tons between my sweaty fingers. Each letter of my full name being written with the devastating feeling that I was fundamentally betraying the woman who raised me, even though our relationship had always been extraordinarily complicated, filled with subtle emotional blackmail, refined psychological manipulations, and power games that made me spend years in psychoanalytic therapy, desperately trying to understand where genuine maternal love ended, and obsessive control disguised as care began. The specialized psychiatric clinic was strategically located in a remote wooded area on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high concrete walls painted white that were discreetly topped with disguised electric fences, with century-old trees that seemed to form a natural barrier between the real world of the mentally sound and that disturbing parallel universe where people progressively lost contact with shared reality. The main building of the institution had 3 floors with standardized hospital architecture from the 80s, windows with security bars discreetly painted white to appear less prison-like and more therapeutic, meticulously well-maintained gardens with ornamental fountains and wooden benches that tried to create an atmosphere of forced tranquility, but only managed to superficially mask the oppressive nature of the place. When we arrived for the bureaucratic process of admission on a cloudy Monday morning, my mother was strangely calm and resigned, almost serene in her acceptance of what was happening, holding my hand with a disproportionate strength that left red marks on my fingers and repeatedly whispering with a hoarse voice, "6 months, Marina. In exactly 6 months, you will understand absolutely everything. You will beg for my forgiveness on your knees." I interpreted that enigmatic phrase as yet another disconnected delusion, another manifestation of the mental disorganization that had taken over her psyche. I had no way to imagine or suspect it was a prophecy calculated with mathematical precision, a veiled threat carefully disguised as madness. The first 15 days of hospitalization were absolutely infernal, with constant and desperate calls from the clinical team reporting serious behavioral crises, outbursts of aggression against staff and other patients, systematic refusal to take prescribed medication, elaborate escape attempts that included bribing staff and manipulating more vulnerable patients. Nurse Claudia, a 38-year-old Black woman with strong, expressive features but a surprisingly gentle and welcoming voice who seemed to have developed infinite patience after years of dealing with severe psychiatric patients, religiously called me every day at the same time with detailed updates on Helena's condition. "Your mother spent the entire night awake, obsessively walking in circles in her room, murmuring about conspiracies and family betrayals. Today, she categorically refused to eat any food, saying the food was poisoned with mind control substances. Unfortunately, we had to apply mechanical physical restraint because she tried to violently assault another patient who approached her in the cafeteria. Each phone call was like receiving a direct punch to the stomach, a painful confirmation that I had made the correct but devastating decision to commit her, but also a constant and torturous reminder that I had effectively placed my own biological mother in a psychiatric hospital against her express wishes. Visits were strictly limited to twice a week following institutional protocol, Wednesdays and Sundays, always punctually from 2 to 4 o'clock without exceptions or extensions permitted. I religiously attended each scheduled visit, carrying heavy bags with specific and often bizarre items she requested through notes scribbled in shaky handwriting, old interior design magazines from the 90s that she swore contained coded government messages, imported chocolates of a specific Swiss brand only found at a delicatessen across town because she believed the special cocoa neutralized electromagnetic waves, an expensive French perfume from Chanel that she had worn throughout my childhood, and now categorically claimed that its aroma helped keep telepathic mental invaders away from her consciousness. During these tense and emotionally exhausting visits, she erratically alternated between moments of almost convincing apparent lucidity, where we would talk about everyday trivialities like the weather, the flowers in the clinic's garden, or old television programs we watched together when I was a child, and sudden violent outbursts of elaborate paranoia where she would hysterically accuse me of secretly conspiring with the doctors to steal her inheritance, an inheritance that ironically consisted of a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a peripheral area and a state teacher's pension that barely covered her basic monthly expenses. The dramatic inconsistency of her behavior left me emotionally drained, never knowing which version of my mother I would encounter at each visit, The sweet, nostalgic woman who lovingly recalled moments from my childhood, or the paranoid and aggressive creature who saw me as a mortal enemy, conspiring for her destruction. Roberto made exactly one lightning visit during the first 2 months of hospitalization, appearing on a rainy Sunday afternoon in his immaculate Italian suit and ostentatious Rolex watch, stayed precisely 15 chronometered minutes, deposited a generic bouquet of flowers hastily purchased at the hospital convenience store, muttered some empty words about hope for quick improvement, and disappeared claiming to have an unavoidable international video conference with Asian investors. "You're handling this admirably, Marina," he said condescendingly before hurriedly departing, as if it were a compliment that I was taking on all the emotional and logistical responsibility of the situation alone, as if his systematic absence were a virtue and not cowardice disguised as corporate pragmatism. My mother didn't even raise her eyes to acknowledge his presence throughout the visit, kept her gaze fixed and empty on the barred window, monotonously murmuring something about mechanical birds equipped with surveillance cameras sent by the intelligence agency to monitor her thoughts. After Roberto hastily departed, leaving only the nauseating smell of his expensive perfume, she slowly turned to me and said with a frightening clarity that completely contrasted with her previous behavior, "He was never really here. You know that perfectly well, don't you? Roberto drowned when he was 5 years old on that beach trip. This imposter who comes here is an actor hired by the government to watch me." For a brief and terrifying moment, the absolute conviction in her voice made me question my own perception of reality, made me doubt whether my brother was real or an elaborate collective hallucination that we shared. It was exactly in this disturbing moment that I viscerally understood how tenuous and fragile is the veil between sanity and madness, how easily we could slip into that downward spiral of delusions and paranoia if we didn't maintain a firm anchor in shared consensual reality. The group therapy sessions were methodically conducted by psychologist Lucas, a 40-year-old man who initially seemed too young and inexperienced to be dealing with such complex and challenging psychiatric cases, with his perpetually disheveled blonde hair, stubble, and a smile that seemed too genuine and optimistic for that gloomy hospital environment. But gradually I realized that he possessed a special gift, almost supernatural, for dealing with the most difficult patients. A unique way of making them feel truly heard and understood without validating or reinforcing their pathological delusions, masterfully navigating that thin and dangerous line between therapeutic empathy and confrontation with reality. My mother, surprisingly, seemed to like him and actively participated in group sessions, although her contributions were invariably loaded with elaborate conspiracy theories and veiled or explicit accusations against me. "My daughter Marina put me here because she wants to get my apartment before I die," she declared dramatically in a session that I could discreetly observe through a one-way mirror, her voice laden with theatrical sorrow. "She has always been envious of everything I had, always wanted to steal my life, my youth, my beauty. Even my late husband had eyes for her when she was a teenager. I saw his looks, the sinful intentions." The accusation was so absurd, so completely disconnected from any reality. My father had died of a sudden heart attack when I was only 16 years old, and our relationship was always one of distant but respectful affection, without any indication of impropriety. That it made me question if that delirious creature was really my mother or if some malevolent entity had taken possession of her body, transforming her into an unrecognizable stranger who inhabited the familiar shell. Dona Carmen, the elderly 72-year-old neighbor who had known my mother for more than 3 decades and was her only true friend, called me crying copiously after a particularly disturbing visit to the clinic. "I no longer recognize the Helena I've known all my life," she sobbed on the phone with a choked voice. "She told me horrible and cruel things, accused me of always having been envious of her, said that I tried to seduce her husband for years, that I placed hidden cameras and microphones in her apartment to monitor her private life and sell information to tabloids." Dona Carmen was a sweet and kind lady who had taken care of me countless times during my childhood when my mother needed to work late, who made the best carrot cake with chocolate frosting in the world, and who treated Helena like a younger sister. Hearing that even she was being targeted by paranoid delusional accusations broke my heart in a different and deeper way, because it meant that my mother's mental illness did not discriminate, indiscriminately attacked everyone who was once important to her, destroying decades of friendship and shared memories. I desperately tried to console Dona Carmen, patiently explain that it was the psychotic delusions speaking, not the real Helena that we knew and loved. But even as I pronounced those comforting words, I anguishedly wondered if there really was this clear distinction, If we could really separate the person from the disease when the mental pathology seemed to have completely consumed and replaced who the person used to be. The philosophical question tormented me during sleepless nights. At what exact point does someone cease to be who they were and irreversibly transform into something else? Was Helena still my mother, or just a sick simulacrum inhabiting her aging body? In the 3rd month of hospital admission, there was a subtle but noticeable change in her behavioral pattern that professionals initially interpreted as a positive response to pharmacological treatment. The violent outbursts decreased drastically in frequency and intensity. She began to accept antipsychotic medication without physical or verbal resistance, participated in occupational therapeutic activities with what the medical team enthusiastically described as encouraging and promising progress. Dr. Beatrice Fontana, who had taken over the case as the responsible psychiatrist after the previous doctor went on medical leave due to burnout, showed cautious but hopeful optimism during our bi-weekly update meetings. Acute psychotic disorders can have periods of spontaneous or medication-induced remission. She patiently explained to me during a family meeting where Roberto participated by video conference from his office in another city, claiming to be in quarantine due to exposure to a COVID case, but clearly healthy and just avoiding the discomfort of being physically present. It is crucial to maintain constant vigilance and not rush hospital discharge prematurely, as relapses are common and can be even more severe. Dr. Fontana had a peculiar and distinctive way of tilting her head slightly to one side when she heard something that captured her professional attention, like a curious bird studying something intriguing, and I noticed she made this gesture frequently when we discussed Helena's specific behaviors. "Your mother is a particularly interesting and complex case," she commented once after an individual session with Helena, and something indefinable in her tone caused an involuntary shiver down my spine, an instinctive sensation that there were layers to this observation that I couldn't yet fully comprehend. There's an almost performative quality to some of her outbursts, an underlying awareness that isn't typical of classic organic psychotic conditions. At the time, I interpreted the comment as a clinical observation about the atypical presentation of symptoms, not as the first indication that something much more sinister and calculated was happening. The letters began arriving in the 4th month of hospitalization. Simple white envelopes with no visible return address, addressed with that elaborate and baroque handwriting my mother always had, full of dramatic flourishes and exaggerated curves that transformed even grocery lists into calligraphic works. The letters were simultaneously coherent in their grammatical structure and deeply disturbing in their delusional content. "Dear Marina," began one of them that I read so many times I involuntarily memorized every word. "I know you believe you're doing what's best for me, but you urgently need to understand that there are greater and sinister forces at play here. The doctors are all bought by the pharmaceutical industry. They're part of the globalist system that wants to silence and control us. But I'm smarter than all of them put together. I pretend to swallow the medications and then spit them into the toilet. I pretend to believe their lies during the brainwashing sessions. Soon, very soon, I'll escape from here and then you'll finally see the naked truth." I read and reread those letters obsessively, desperately searching between the lines for some recognizable sign of the mother I had known for 42 years, some trace of the woman who, despite all her character flaws and manipulative tendencies, raised me, educated me, and took care of me during childhood illnesses. But all I found were overlapping layers of elaborate paranoia, conspiracy theories about secret medical experiments, mind control through electromagnetic waves, replacement of people with clones or androids, and even alien abductions disguised as psychiatric treatment. Each letter was more delusional than the previous one, a downward spiral of madness documented on paper that made me cry with frustration and despair. The 5th month brought a surprising stabilization that the medical team interpreted as almost miraculous and celebrated as a therapeutic victory. Helena was taking all prescribed medication without resistance, actively participating in all therapeutic modalities offered, socializing appropriately with other patients, even developing what appeared to be genuine friendships with some women her age hospitalized for severe depression. During bi-weekly visits, we maintained almost normal conversations about everyday matters. She asked about my work as an architecture professor at the university, showed interest in my research projects, commented on books she was reading in the clinic's library, demonstrated what seemed to be genuine remorse and insight about the temporary mental problems she had caused. "I know I haven't been easy for you, Marina," she said on a sunny Sunday afternoon as we walked slowly through the clinic's therapeutic garden, observing other patients in their supervised activities. "But you need to understand that sometimes the human mind plays cruel tricks on us. makes us believe in absurd things that aren't real, see threats where none exist. The crystalline lucidity of that moment was so perfect, so complete and convincing, that I allowed myself for the first time in months to have genuine hope that perhaps we could rebuild some kind of functional relationship. Perhaps we could overcome decades of accumulated hurt, emotional manipulations, and destructive psychological games to find some kind of peace and reconciliation. Roberto, predictably, interpreted the dramatic improvement as confirmation that I had exaggerated from the beginning, that the hospitalization had been an extreme and unnecessary measure, that I had always been too dramatic and hypersensitive to deal rationally with small maternal eccentricities. You see, Marina? I warned you it was just a phase, an episode of stress that you transformed into a Greek tragedy, he commented arrogantly during one of the very rare phone calls, completely oblivious to the months of intense suffering and emotional chaos that preceded that apparent improvement. His ability to rewrite history to fit his convenient narrative of a son too successful to get involved in minor family dramas deeply disgusted me. It was on a seemingly ordinary Thursday of the 6th month of hospitalization that the meticulously constructed house of cards began to spectacularly collapse. I had arrived for an extra visit specially authorized by Dr. Fontana to discuss the details of the possible hospital discharge and preparation for Helena's gradual return home with outpatient follow-up. I arrived earlier than the agreed time, anxious and hopeful about the possibility of finally closing that traumatic chapter of our lives. While waiting at the clinic reception, absently leafing through an old medical magazine, familiar voices coming from an adjacent room with a half-open door captured my attention. I instantly recognized my mother's voice, but it wasn't the hesitant, medicated voice I had grown accustomed to hearing in recent months. It was clear, articulate, and perfectly lucid, without any trace of the mental confusion or pharmaceutical dulling that supposedly afflicted her. 6 months? I told her it would be 6 months and she would come back begging on her knees for my forgiveness. She laughed with a calculated coldness that froze the blood in my veins. Look, it didn't even take all that time. She's already here discussing my discharge, desperate to fix things, consumed by guilt for having committed her own mother. The idiot doesn't even suspect it was all theater. Every outburst, every delusion, every tear shed. The floor seemed to disappear beneath my feet as I processed the horror of what I was hearing, my mind initially refusing to accept the devastating reality being revealed. "Did you really believe I was psychotic?" Helena continued, apparently speaking on a cell phone with someone. "My dear, these were the best 6 months of acting in my life. All those years in amateur theater finally served some useful purpose. That ungrateful and negligent daughter needed to learn a lesson about abandonment, needed to viscerally understand what it really means to care for someone, to worry, to feel the crushing weight of guilt. Now she knows. Now she will never be able to abandon me again. She'll spend the rest of her life trying to make up for these 6 months. My entire world collapsed in that moment, standing paralyzed in the hospital corridor with my hand trembling on the doorknob, unable to enter, unable to flee, unable even to breathe properly. 6 months. 6 months of anguish that consumed me like acid, of sleepless nights tortured by guilt, of obsessive questioning about every decision I had made. 6 months watching what I believed to be my mother's progressive mental deterioration, crying in the hospital parking lot after each visit. 6 months of elaborate lies, of psychological manipulation at a level I never thought possible, of cruelty so refined and calculated that it bordered on psychopathic. Nurse Claudia found me minutes later, still paralyzed in the corridor, silent tears running down my face while my entire body shook uncontrollably. "Marina, are you okay? Do you need help?" she asked with concern, and I could only point with a trembling hand to the half-open door, unable to form coherent words. She must have immediately realized that something extremely serious had happened, because she ran to call Dr. Fontana, who arrived in less than 3 minutes with a professionally controlled expression, but eyes showing genuine concern. The confrontation that followed was simultaneously surreal and revealing. Helena, caught in absolute flagranti, initially tried to deny, then feign another improvised psychotic episode, contorting her face into expressions of madness that I now recognized as purely theatrical. But Dr. Beatrice Fontana was not easily fooled. In fact, as I later discovered, she had suspected for weeks that something was fundamentally wrong with the clinical picture presented. "Mrs. Helena," the psychiatrist said, with that professional calm that I now understood masked an analytical mind sharp as a scalpel, "I've suspected for some time that your episodes were too convenient, too timed, too theatrical. The psychologist Lucas also noticed glaring inconsistencies in your behavior during group sessions. You quoted symptoms directly from diagnostic manuals, word for word, something genuinely psychotic patients would never do. But we needed concrete and irrefutable evidence. I then discovered that Dr. Fontana, following ethical protocols but taking advantage of legal loopholes, had discreetly installed audio recorders in the common room after her suspicions intensified. The recordings, which she presented to us as evidence, were devastating. Helena meticulously planning each crisis, studying psychiatric symptoms in medical books that Mrs. Carmen innocently smuggled in, thinking she was helping a sick friend understand her condition, practicing facial expressions of madness in the shared bathroom mirror when she thought she was alone. Why? Was all I could articulate when I finally minimally recovered my voice. Sitting in the clinic's director's office with Helena in front of me, now without masks, without pretense, without the elaborate theater she maintained for half a year. Why would you do something so cruel? So monstrous to me? My voice was hoarse from crying, broken by the unthinkable betrayal I was trying to process. Because you abandoned me. Helena responded with a coldness that made me understand that I had never really known the woman who raised me. Because you chose to live far away, chose your mediocre teaching career, chose your pathetic independent little life instead of taking care of me like a good daughter should. Roberto at least has the excuse of living in another city and making real money, but you consciously chose to leave me alone. So I needed to teach you an unforgettable lesson, needed to make you feel the crushing weight of guilt, understand what it is to be truly responsible for someone, feel the despair of seeing someone you love, or pretend to love, losing their sanity. Each word was a poisoned dagger. Each sentence revealed layers of pathological narcissism and emotional manipulation that transcended anything I had experienced or imagined possible, even from her, even knowing her controlling and manipulative tendencies throughout my life. Dr. Fontana clinically explained that what Helena had done constituted not only fraud against the healthcare system. After all, the health insurance had paid for 6 months of psychiatric hospitalization based on completely false diagnoses, but also severe psychological abuse, systematic emotional torture. This is technically known as Munchausen syndrome, the psychiatrist explained, although in this specific case it's an extremely rare and cruel variation where the person feigns symptoms not primarily for medical attention, but to manipulate and emotionally torture specific family members. It is frankly one of the most severe cases of family manipulation I've encountered in 20 years of psychiatry. The complete revelation of my mother's elaborate charade triggered a sequence of legal and emotional events that extended for months after that devastating afternoon at the psychiatric clinic, completely transforming my understanding of the limits of human manipulation and the distorted nature of what I had considered maternal love during 42 years of existence. The clinic immediately initiated complex administrative procedures to deal with the unprecedented case of a patient who had defrauded the mental health system through a theatrical performance sustained for 6 consecutive months, deceiving experienced professionals, manipulating dedicated staff, and wasting precious medical resources that could have been directed to patients genuinely in need of urgent psychiatric treatment. Dr. Beatriz Fontana, maintaining her professional composure despite the evident shock of having been partially deceived by such a skilled manipulator, explained that Helena would face severe legal consequences, including possible criminal charges for healthcare fraud, false statements, and especially for severe psychological abuse against a family member in a situation of emotional vulnerability. Marina, what your mother did transcends any traditional diagnostic category in psychiatry, Dr. Fontana explained to me during a long private conversation after the initial confrontation, her dark eyes showing a mixture of professional fascination and moral repulsion. Although she is not psychotic in the classical sense, she definitely presents a severe narcissistic personality disorder with marked antisocial traits, a combination that makes her capable of extremely elaborate manipulations without experiencing genuine guilt or remorse. The fact that she maintained this charade for so long, deceiving trained professionals and deliberately causing suffering to her own daughter, indicates a level of psychopathy that we rarely encounter outside prison environments. His words confirmed what I already suspected but was afraid to admit. My mother was fundamentally different from most people, lacked basic empathy, and saw human relationships as power games where manipulation and control were the only currencies that mattered. Roberto, when he finally understood the magnitude of what had happened through a tense video conference where Dr. Fontana presented the recorded evidence, demonstrated a reaction that oscillated between disbelief and a pathetic attempt to minimize the gravity of the situation, to protect his own comfortable narrative of a son too successful to get involved in family drama. This is absolutely ridiculous. Our mother has always been dramatic, but would never be capable of something so elaborate, he initially insisted, his flushed face visible even through the pixelated screen. But when confronted with the audio recordings where Helena described her plan in detail and ridiculed both children, especially him for being a pretentious idiot who thinks money can buy love, Roberto finally went silent, his expression changing from arrogance to something that seemed like genuine discomfort, perhaps even shame for having been so completely deceived and manipulated from a distance. The process of discharging Helena from the clinic was extraordinarily complex, involving not just medical and administrative issues but also significant legal implications that required the presence of lawyers, public prosecutors, and even forensic experts specialized in health system fraud cases. For 3 endless weeks, while the legal bureaucracy unfolded with frustrating slowness, Helena remained in the clinic no longer as a psychiatric patient, but essentially as a detainee awaiting transfer to face criminal charges for her actions. The most disturbing part was observing how she seemed genuinely proud of what she had done, treating the entire situation as the grand finale of a masterful theatrical performance that deserved applause instead of condemnation. "You have to admit it was brilliant," she said during one of the meetings with authorities, her smug smile showing a total absence of remorse. "None of you suspected for months I deserved a Best Actress award for this performance." The public exposure of the case was inevitable in an era of social media and sensationalist journalism, and within days the story had gone viral, with dramatic headlines describing the mother who faked insanity for 6 months to torture her daughter, appearing in all major media outlets. Reporters began to persistently seek me out, wanting exclusive interviews, sordid details, family photographs, anything that could feed the public's veracity for real family dramas. I systematically refused all requests, not to protect Helena, but to preserve my own mental health already fragile from the trauma. But Helena, in her pathological need for attention and validation, gave unauthorized interviews from confinement, distorting the narrative to present herself as a misunderstood mother who had resorted to extreme measures to regain the love of an ungrateful daughter, transforming herself into a kind of tragic heroine for people who didn't know the true details of the cruel manipulation she had orchestrated. The emotional impact on all people peripherally involved in the case was devastating and long-lasting. Nurse Claudia, who had cared for Helena with genuine dedication for months, developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and had to take medical leave to process the trauma of having been so completely deceived. "How can I trust my professional judgment again?" she confessed to me in an emotional phone conversation weeks later. "If I couldn't perceive that it was all pretense, how many other patients might be manipulating me right now?" Therapist Lucas also reported questioning his diagnostic skills, even though he had been one of the first to suspect the charade. Donna Carmen, the elderly neighbor who had inadvertently helped Helena by providing materials on psychiatry, fell into deep depression, feeling responsible for my suffering, even though I had repeatedly explained that she had been just another victim of Helena's Machiavellian manipulation. During the legal process that followed, even more disturbing details about Helena's meticulous planning came to light through thorough investigations. It was discovered that she had begun planning the entire farce a year before execution, extensively researching psychiatric symptoms in public libraries, watching documentaries about psychiatric hospitals, even attending support groups for families of patients with mental disorders to learn how families reacted to psychotic episodes of loved ones. She had kept a detailed diary documenting her planning, which was seized as evidence, where she described with clinical coldness how she intended to teach Marina an unforgettable lesson about abandonment and guilt. The diary entries revealed a calculating and vindictive mind that saw her own daughter's emotional suffering as a personal victory, proof of her supreme power and control. The judicial sentence, delivered after 4 months of legal proceedings, was relatively lenient considering the gravity of the psychological abuse perpetrated. Helena received 2 years of house arrest with electronic monitoring, a substantial fine for healthcare fraud, and mandatory supervised outpatient psychiatric treatment. The judge, an elderly gentleman who seemed genuinely disturbed by the case, explained that Helena's advanced age and absence of criminal record had influenced the decision, but made it clear that any violation of the imposed conditions would result in immediate imprisonment. "You have demonstrated a capacity for manipulation and cruelty that we normally associate with violent criminals," he said directly to Helena during the reading of the sentence. The fact that your victim is your own daughter makes your crimes even more repugnant. Society and your family need to be protected from your manipulative tendencies." Helena listened to the sentence with that same enigmatic smile, as if she knew something that we all didn't, as if she was still in control of the situation despite all evidence to the contrary. When she had the opportunity to speak, her final words in court were directed exclusively at me. "Marina, dear daughter, you may have won this legal battle, but we both know you will never be truly free of me. Every time you question whether someone is being genuine with you, every time you doubt displays of affection, every time you feel guilt for establishing healthy boundaries, you will remember these 6 months. I am permanently engraved in your psyche, dear. This is true maternal love, indelible, inescapable, eternal." Her words were pure poison distilled in verbal form, designed to plant seeds of doubt and trauma that would flourish in the years to come. The period immediately after the trial was marked by a desperate attempt to rebuild something resembling normality in my completely shattered life. I returned to work at the university, but discovered I had become an unwanted celebrity on campus, with students whispering in the corridors and colleagues treating me with an uncomfortable mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. My lectures on architectural theory, which previously flowed naturally, were now punctuated by moments of dissociation where I caught myself questioning if I was really there or if everything was part of another elaborate manipulation. The basic trust in reality, something most people take for granted, had been fundamentally shaken by the discovery that 6 months of my life had been based on a meticulously constructed lie. Roberto, after the initial shock, tried to approach by offering support that seemed more motivated by guilt than genuine fraternal concern. "Marina, perhaps we should sell her apartment and split the money so you can do therapy," he suggested during one of the rare calls, demonstrating how even after everything that had happened, he still saw solutions primarily through financial lenses. When I refused his offer and suggested that he also consider therapy to process the family trauma, he quickly changed the subject and returned to his habitual pattern of minimal contact, apparently preferring to maintain emotional and geographical distance from anything that would force him to confront the family dysfunctions we had normalized for decades. Intensive therapy with a new psychologist specialized in family trauma and victims of narcissistic abuse became my anchor during the following months. Dr. Patricia Mendez, a 60-year-old woman with extensive experience in cases of extreme family manipulation, helped me understand that what Helena had done was merely the most dramatic manifestation of an abuse pattern that had existed throughout my life, but which I had been conditioned not to recognize or question. "Your mother spent decades preparing the ground for this final manipulation," she explained during a particularly revealing session. "Each small emotional blackmail, each subtle manipulation, each violation of boundaries she committed during your childhood and adult life was a brick in the construction of the psychological prison where she hoped to keep you forever. The fake breakdown was just her boldest attempt to tighten the bars of that prison." During these therapeutic sessions, I began to identify disturbing patterns that had been invisible to me before. Helena's convenient illnesses whenever I had something important in my life, the dramatic crises when I tried to establish independence, the subtle threats of suicide or abandonment when I didn't give in to her demands. Everything had been part of an elaborate system of control that culminated in the farce of 6 months of institutionalization. Therapy was painful, like performing emotional surgery without anesthesia, extracting decades of toxic conditioning and examining psychological wounds that I had learned to ignore or minimize. But it was also liberating, each session removing one more layer of unjustified guilt and bringing me closer to a genuine understanding that I was not responsible for my mother's pathology. 1 year after the revelation of the farce, I received a letter from Helena through her lawyer. She was serving house arrest in the apartment she had so often used as a tool for emotional blackmail, supposedly following the mandatory psychiatric treatment, although I suspected she was merely performing sanity in the same way she had performed madness. The letter was a masterpiece of passive, aggressive manipulation, alternating between false apologies and veiled accusations, attempts to elicit pity and subtle threats of future drama if I didn't forgive her and resume contact. "Dear Marina, I hope you are well and have found the peace you always sought away from your mother. I accept that I went too far in my attempt to make you understand my love, but a desperate mother is capable of anything. I am old, sick, and alone, serving an unjust sentence for loving too much. If something happens to me during this forced isolation, I hope you can live with your conscience." I read the letter only once before giving it to my lawyer to file as evidence of violation of the no-contact order that had been established. I didn't respond. not taking the carefully prepared emotional bait. This was my first real act of liberation, choosing not to engage with the manipulation, not allowing Helena's poisonous words to penetrate the psychological defenses I was laboriously building. Dr. Patricia congratulated me on my progress, noting that many victims of maternal narcissistic abuse take decades to manage ignoring such elaborate manipulation attempts. 2 years have passed since that fateful day in the psychiatric clinic when I discovered the truth about Helena's cruel theater. During this period, I rebuilt my life piece by piece, like an architect restoring a historic building damaged by an earthquake, maintaining the fundamental structure, but reinforcing the foundations, and removing toxic decorative elements that threatened the integrity of the whole. I developed genuine friendships with people who demonstrated real empathy and emotional reciprocity, characteristics I had been programmed not to value or even recognize. My work at the university flourished when I channeled my traumatic experience into research on how architectural environments can facilitate or hinder recovery from psychological trauma, transforming personal pain into meaningful academic contribution. The last indirect contact with Helena occurred through a legal notification, informing that she had been arrested for violating the conditions of her house arrest by trying to contact distant relatives to spread distorted versions of the story and recruit allies for a new manipulation campaign against me. Her sentence was converted to regular prison for 6 months, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely no guilt or responsibility for her fate. Helena had made conscious and calculated choices to cause psychological harm, and the consequences of these choices were entirely her responsibility. This perception, simple but profound, represented the final moment of my emotional liberation from the psychological bonds she had woven around me for 42 years. Roberto predictably remained distant throughout this recovery process, sending generic messages on commemorative dates and continuing his life of successful business and superficial relationships. In a rare phone conversation, he admitted that he preferred not to think too much about what happened because it was too disturbing to imagine that our mother was capable of that. His voluntary denial was another type of prison, different from mine but equally limiting. While I had chosen to confront the brutal truth and process the trauma, he chose emotional numbness and geographic distance as defense mechanisms. I don't judge him for this. Each person processes trauma in their own way. But our fraternal relationship remains superficial and functionally non-existent, another collateral damage of Helena's toxicity. Today, 4 years after the beginning of that hellish journey, I can finally say that I've found something resembling peace. It's not the peace of ignorance I had before discovering Helena's true nature, but a peace conquered through arduous psychological battles, consistent therapy, and the daily choice not to allow the poison of the past to contaminate my present and future. I still have occasional nightmares where I discover that my entire current life is another elaborate farce, where people I love reveal themselves as manipulators wearing masks. But these episodes are increasingly less frequent and less intense, my psyche gradually accepting that, although the extreme evil that Helena represents is real, it is also exceptional. The deepest lesson I extracted from this traumatic experience transcends my personal story and touches on universal truths about human nature and the dangers of misdirected, unconditional love. I learned that some people are fundamentally incapable of genuine love, seeing relationships only as power games where manipulation and control are the only objectives. I learned that blood ties don't guarantee loyalty or protection, and that true family is defined by mutual respect and genuine care, not by shared DNA. More importantly, I learned that establishing firm boundaries and maintaining distance from toxic people, even when they're our parents, isn't cruelty. It's essential psychological survival. Helena is now 72 years old, living in a supervised nursing home after serving her sentence, still occasionally trying to contact me through third parties with stories about fabricated terminal illnesses and melodramatic last wishes. I don't respond. Not out of anger or desire for revenge, but from clear understanding that any contact would only feed her pathology and reopen wounds that I've worked hard to heal. She chose to destroy our maternal relationship through one of the most cruel manipulations imaginable, and the consequences of that choice include the loneliness and abandonment she so feared, but ultimately caused through her own destructive actions. The terror of those 6 months of elaborate farce fundamentally transformed me, but not in the way Helena intended. Instead of becoming her perpetual emotional prisoner, consumed by guilt and distorted obligation, I became a strengthened survivor who deeply understands the mechanisms of manipulation and psychological abuse. I use this hard-won knowledge to help others facing similar situations, facilitating support groups for victims of narcissistic family abuse, sharing my story when appropriate to validate the experiences of others struggling to escape psychological family prisons. My pain was transformed into purpose, my trauma into testimony that it's possible to survive and thrive after even the most devastating family betrayals. Did you like Mariana's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.